And then we'll get started back up. Welcome everyone to workshop session 1 for the 4th annual Silicon Valley API Civic Leadership Summit. This year's theme, AAPI Women Looking Forward. My name is Thu Nguyen, and I'm the Executive Director for the Vietnamese American Roundtable. And I also teach Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University, San Jose State University, and work across the Vietnamese diaspora. For the workshop today, our central questions are around how can community members engage with advocates working in the anti-Asian hate realm or space? How can we as participants learn about the work across different communities, subgroups, issues, intersections, what it means, and how to get involved? And so for today's workshop session, I have the pleasure of providing y'all with a little bit of context into how we put this workshop together and to introduce our guest presenters for today. So we really wanted to be able to figure out ways to connect with local advocacy orgs, organizing orgs, and make those connections for us here in Silicon Valley in a localized context, right? So how have we been addressing anti-Asian hate across generations, across different subgroups, and what else can we do? Where can we go from here 2 years since the beginning of the pandemic? And so how today's workshop will work is for the first portion of it, our guests will have a presentation. The presentation will be followed by a bit of a moderated discussion, and then during the moderated discussion and into the close of the workshop, we'll have opportunities for Q&A, and of course, y'all can always add any questions you have or any gas or hype into the chat. So without further ado, time to introduce our guest panelists, workshop presenters for today. First, I'd like to introduce Ms. Thu Nguyen, who is the Executive Director of OCA National, a graduate from Rice University with degrees in chemistry and sociology. Thu found her way into the nonprofit sector through organizing Asian American students on campus and bridging partnerships between student groups and local Houston community organizations. She curated the first Asian American student art gallery at Rice, which pioneered the university's annual underground Asian American art exhibition. Before OCA, she freelanced for nonprofits and Asian-owned startups to do community outreach and social media marketing. In her capacity, Thu oversees storytelling, relationships, and operations for OCA. She brings a unique understanding of grassroots organizing as the chair of the Asian American Media Alliance and sits on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council for Charter. With her spare time, Thu focuses on the intersection of advocacy with small businesses. She works 5 to 9 in hospitality, cosmetology, and zine making, and you can find her exploring how to space make on her website, which we'll link in the chat, thutowin.org. So welcome, Thu.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Alongside Thu for our presentation today is Stephanie Hu, a freshman at Harvard University who is the founder and executive director of Dear Asian Youth and the co-founder of CUSD, or Capistrano Unified School District Against Racism. Her identity as a Chinese American has pushed her to passionately uplift marginalized voices into intersectional activism. Stephanie's organization, Dear Asian Youth, currently has over 180 chapters worldwide, 400 works of literature, and 110,000 social media followers. Stephanie is also the co-executive director of the Women of Color Conference, which united over 4,850 girls of color in engaging in a 2-day virtual conference with career-oriented panels from 31 renowned speakers and $4,000 in scholarships. In addition, Stephanie previously served as the Education Policy Director of the California Association of Student Councils, where she hosted 2 education policy conferences to empower California students to produce 10 policy proposals. And to my knowledge, Stephanie, you're also a poet and a creative yourself, right? So welcome, Stephanie. And with that, I will pass the mic over to you both as I work the Zoom screen sharing magic in the back end.
Amazing. Hi, everyone. I hope you're all having a great day. We have a presentation prepared, so I'm just going to wait for that to pop up. Lovely. Okay, awesome. So I can first start off by introducing a little bit more about Dear Asian Youth, how it started, what our mission is, and kind of where we're going as well. So next slide, please. Okay, so what is Dear Asian Youth? Dear Asian Youth is a youth-led global organization that promotes intersectional activism, solidarity with other marginalized communities, and equality and equity. So we have a digital platform. We also do a lot of grassroots organizing and community-based advocacy. And what we really try to do is showcase the diversity in the Asian community, as well as accurate and holistic representation. So a little bit more about where we started. So for a little bit of context, I was born in the US, but I moved to Taiwan at a very young age. And after that, I then moved to China. So I spent the majority of my childhood in Asia. And when I moved to the States, that was in 8th grade. And 8th grade in middle school is like already hard enough to get by just as any other like regular middle schooler, but with the added kind of like identity as an immigrant, and especially as like a Chinese immigrant, I found that I experienced a lot of microaggressions. I found that I experienced a lot of racism in my community. And I think what was even more difficult about that was the fact that I kind of moved to the States without my parents. So both of my parents stayed in China throughout like all the years that I've been here since I moved before my 8th grade year. And because of that, there was a lot of honestly self-hatred that I experienced growing up for my identity. I definitely wanted to conceal my Asian American identity. I wasn't proud of it at all. And I think what really changed it was when I entered high school, and especially when COVID struck and we were all in quarantine in 2020, and just seeing what was going on in the world, seeing what was going on in the news, seeing the anti-Asian hate that was occurring. I think I really felt a lot of anger towards racism against Asian Americans. And at the same time, I really began to feel a sense of pride within my identity. So I expressed a lot of that through a poetry blog that I started. The poetry blog was called Dear Asian Youth. And I would start every single poem with like Dear Asian Youth and then start my poetry. So I really wanted just to create a platform where other people could resonate with what I was writing. So then it kind of turned into a blog, and then it turned into a literary magazine. And then now it's the organization that it is today. So today we actually have over 300 members on our national team. Sorry, this slide deck wasn't updated, and over 180 chapters across the globe. And today we're an organization that completely functions remotely. We have members from all around the world. Our director board, our executive board actually also has like members from joining in from Pakistan, from Ireland, from the UK, from Hong Kong. So we really have members from across the world. Next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit more about what we do. So I like to think that there's kind of like 5 big parts to what we do. So the first one is community, and we really try to do that with our chapter system. So basically our chapter system is where anyone can start a Dear Asian Youth chapter within their college, within their high school, within their town. So we have chapters in Hong Kong, we have chapters in Seoul, we have chapters in India, in like across the US as well, and in Canada. So basically what they do is they take a piece of Dear Asian Youth back to their own communities and really engage in a lot of grassroots organizing. We also do a lot of storytelling. So we do that mainly through our podcast called Dear Asian Girl. So we have 5 seasons of our podcast right now, and we spotlight the personal stories of Asian women from all walks of life. We also have the power of words. So we feature prose, poetry, opinion pieces, and visual content on our website. and we have like regularly contributing writers on our own team as well as outside submissions. We also have power of discussion. So we host webinars, workshops, campaigns that engage our audience in conversation on societal issues. And lastly, we have the power of virality, which is through our social media platform. So we share our conscientious, informational, and celebratory aspects of our Asian community. Next slide, please. Thank you. So since April of 2020 which was when Dear Asian Youth was founded, we now have over 100,000 followers on our Instagram, 5 podcast seasons, 400 published pieces. We've hosted 2 conferences. We have over 300 core team members. In addition to that, 800 chapters. And then we've donated $30,000 to causes that are important to us, whether that be for Black Lives Matter or Palestine or the Indian COVID crisis. And then we've also hosted more than 30 virtual events. So a little bit more about our social media campaign, because I think that's really where we got our start. So we regularly launch viral digital campaigns and infographics that educate, engage, and reach millions. We currently have over 450 pieces of these like educational infographics that we have on our social media platforms. And a lot of what we do is like towards civic engagement. So for example, voting content, but we also have like celebratory content with like Lunar New Year or really just anything you can think of. We try to celebrate both current events and also just like holidays and cultural events as well. Next slide, please. One of our biggest events that we launched was actually the Women of Color Conference. So in the March of 2021, we worked with 3 other youth organizations to bring together the first ever Women of Color Conference. The story of how this conference came about is actually really funny. So we were all added to the same Instagram group chat of just young organization or like organizers. And we found that a lot of us were women of color. A lot of our organizations were centered around racial justice. And we were talking about potentially hosting a conference to celebrate that. And then 9 months later, it had fully come into fruition. And basically, it was a 2-day virtual conference where we inspired young girls of color to become the change in their communities. So we had over 31 speakers, 9 panels, 2 workshops, among a bunch of other things. And we were able to successfully unite over 4,850 attendees. And it was just so incredibly inspiring seeing girls from across the globe share their culture, share their perspective, and really create lifelong friendships and relationships. So goals. In 1 year's time, we wish to achieve a little bit more Instagram followers and chapters and more works of literature. But mainly just like growing the organization as a whole. But I think something else sorry, my Slack is going crazy. Something else that we're trying to do as well is more in-person chapter events. So really focusing on that grassroots organizing and then also engaging in policy initiatives as well. Something that is exciting that is coming up is in January, we're hoping to host a Dear Asian Youth Day or a day, where basically we have 9 hubs across the United States, whether that be in LA, in New York City, in DC, in Chicago. And we're hoping to host a like day-wide policy lobbying day. So those are our socials if you want to follow us and support our work. But thank you so much for listening. I hope that gave a little bit more insight into the work that Dear Asian Youth does and what I do. And I'll pass it off to Thu now.
Thanks, Stephanie. Wait, real quick. What is your, well, you're in Boston right now. What is your favorite soupy noodles?
Oh my gosh, great question. I really like a good ramen. You can't go wrong with ramen.
Good choice. Good choice. Awesome. Well, I think that's a great way to segue, sort of, is Stephanie ended on their goal in having their nationwide advocacy day in January, which we also hope to partner with them on. But just to backtrack a little bit about OCA. Oh, and I'm calling from Washington, DC, or Castaway land. and my favorite soupy noodles right now are bumba hui, but it changes every season. So a little bit about OCA. We are almost 50, we turn 50 next year, the second oldest Asian American civil rights organization, sister to the Japanese American Citizens League. And we are also chapter based. We have chapters across the country in currently 24 states with a headquarters in Washington, D.C., where I work at. And so all of our chapters are volunteer grassroots based. And so our headquarters is basically our federal national policy hub as well as resource hub to support our chapters in doing grassroots advocacy work and community service. And so if we go to the next slide, in 2020, actually, or before I get to this event, but our anti-Asian hate work really spans multiple different avenues, because not only were we responding to anti-Asian hate, but with our grassroots nature, our chapters serving the AAPI communities locally, we were responding also to COVID-19 needs, eventually then responding to the Black Lives Matter movement, etc. So there's like multiple layers in which our chapters in OCA responded to anti-Asian hate. But the first really is, in February of 2020, interestingly enough, that was before lockdown and before the spike in anti-Asian rhetoric. There was actually a bill that we supported and congratulated Congress on that was bipartisan, and that was the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. And that act passed with, again, bipartisan support that stated that lynching is now, a hate crime that can be prosecuted. And so I think that bill having passed at the time in February, we knew that coronavirus was starting to spread. There were a couple of cases in the US, but at the time, the narrative was still, oh, this is just another like bird flu or whatnot. And it didn't really impact the Asian American community until March of 2020, when really kind of the first marker, and I had to go back and look at OCA press releases and stuff, because it feels like 2020 was 10 years ago, but March 2020 was when we saw President Trump start tweeting a lot of anti-Asian hate rhetoric, scapegoating our community, putting the blame wrongly on the Asian American community, calling COVID-19 as the Kung Flu virus, China virus, etc. So that's where you see the start of snowballing of widespread use of anti-Asian rhetoric. And so the first thing that our chapters the first way they responded was to have these community forums, roundtable discussions on discriminatory rhetoric and what does that look like, and really start to talk about, have like community support groups, but also have community roundtables to educate our allies and the people around us. A few months after that, next slide, was the murder of George Floyd. And so in the middle of us trying to tackle and push back against this anti-Asian hate rhetoric, we see a kind of resurgence, right, of the Black Lives Matter movement. And that's where we also said, look, like, it's not just anti-Asian hate that's going on. There's police brutality against Black folks, anti-Blackness going on, not in just the mainstream community, but our own community. So then there's a lot of again, still educational work. And you'll see that's kind of what we do a lot with our chapter, similar today, is community education work on what does anti-Blackness look like, how is that similar to anti-Asian hate, and how can, as we are in this building this movement to tackle anti-Asian rhetoric, make sure we're not being anti-Black, etc. Right? And so we had OCA chapters show up at BLM rallies as we continue this kind of conversation around bias, hate, etc. So next slide. Then we started to really kick off a lot of virtual conversations because we were still in lockdown at this point. And so our annual convention turned into a virtual conference just like this one. And that's where we started really trying to pull leaders into having these conversations about the dangers of repeating history, right? Like we talked about Vincent Chin and how he was scapegoated during sorry, my neighborhood is a little loud today. How Vincent Chin was scapegoated during the recession back then as a Japanese auto worker when he was not, the scapegoating of Japanese Americans and the racial profiling of Japanese Americans during World War II. All of that, we started having conversations to not just educate community leaders, but one of the reasons why we have folks like Judy Chu, Erica Lee, Dale and Don, and Helen Zia here was also to pull the attention of elected officials and leaders across the country to really pull them into putting an end to anti-Asian rhetoric. Next slide. And along with like talking about like the danger of repeating history, the danger to democracy, we also wanted to continue talking about unpacking our biases, systemic inequities that causes like anti-Asian and anti-Black hate, etc. Right? So that was kind of towards the end of 2020 when we realized that there needs to be, this is a long-term education project. And so we started developing, next slide, these situational awareness workshops. And they're our version of a bystander intervention training, which you may have seen, floating around, where not only do we want to train people on how to respond when they are witness to a hate incident, whether it's verbal, whether it's physical, whether it's like a microaggression, how do you respond if you're a bystander to a hate incident? But what's unique about our situational awareness workshop is that it incorporates like sitting down and examining our unconscious biases and our power and privileges and how we can each lever our own power and privileges in every kind of scenario, right? Because whether I'm a small, petite Asian American female, or like able-bodied, white male, our power and privileges in certain scenarios look differently, right? But there is always something that you can do in your power during a hate incident. And so these we call them SAW trainings, they launched at the beginning of 2021. They're still ongoing today, and you can register. They happen monthly, once a month, so you can register through our website, ocanational.org, if you're interested. And then eventually we also started doing them in Mandarin and Korean as well, and we're soon to launch a Vietnamese version. And so this is something that we launched at the beginning of 2020, still do, and started doing for community members as well as like corporate employee resource groups, etc. Right? Next slide. Another thing that we wanted our chapters to do was not only were they hosting these roundtables, not only were they working with local law enforcement to make sure that law enforcement was reporting anti-Asian hate incidents, but that also that we start forming walking buddy groups, buddy systems for Asian Americans elders, women, children, whoever who didn't feel safe walking alone. And one of the reasons why our chapters kind of made sure that they started the buddy systems or were working with other organizations who were, is because we didn't want there to be any kind of framework or lens of racial profiling of Black folks, right? Because that's what we saw going on in our community. And so as we partnered with other orgs, corporates such as Lyft also partnered with us to give Lyft rides to folks to do their essential travel. So that was pretty cool. Next slide. And then continuing on like the raising awareness of how much the anti-Asian hate movement is, very much in tandem with like the Black Lives Matter movement and movement against police brutality, is that even two of our community members, Angelo Quinto from California and also Christian Hall from Pennsylvania, were two victims in 2020 of police brutality that mainstream media didn't report on, right? And so as we were still doing all of this like community education, we wanted to make sure that our community remembered and understood that our community is also a victim of police brutality, which is why we also need to stand with our Black and Brown brothers and sisters. Next slide. So that's in 2021. And March of 2021, so shortly after the Hall and Quinto rally was the Atlanta shootings. And this is where we saw the police chief in Atlanta made the excuse of the shooter as having just a bad day. And that, I think, really struck a nerve in all of our community organizers, because we knew that it wasn't just a bad day, that there was targeting of SVACLS, and there was an underlying anti-Asian, misogynist lens to that, right? And then later, of course, they find out that the police chief who called it a bad day is a white supremacist or a racist. And so that makes sense, right? And so now we have to pivot of not just educating the community on anti-Asian hate, anti-Blackness, but also the misogyny and the stereotyping around Asian women and how that ties into the anti-Asian hate rhetoric, and also the fact that with anti-Asian hate incidences, like over 60% of them happen to Asian American women, right? And so that we partner a lot with NAPOP and other orgs to continue this narrative education. Next slide. So throughout the past few years, actually, then we saw increase in demand of educating folks on the history of anti-Asian hate, from when Asian Americans first settled here, Filipino Americans in Louisiana, right? And up until now, there has always been policies, legislations, riots, massacres that have targeted Asian American communities throughout our history. And so for people to say, oh, this is the first time that Asian Americans have stood up and said something, oh, this is the first time that we see Asian American activism, OCA wanted to show that that's totally not true, that, anti-Asian hate crimes are not new, and that Asian American activism isn't new as well. And so we started these series on different hate incidences and the movements around them, and they were both for the community, but also a lot of corporations internally realize not only do they have to educate themselves on the Black Lives Matter movement and what anti-Asian hate rhetoric is, but just in general and Asian American history. And so we were doing a lot of that education work as well. And then next slide. So yeah, this is just an example of our partnerships with other national orgs, educating folks on the different avenues of anti-Asian hate, like racial profiling in the federal government. Yeah, next slide. And so basically by the end of 2021, we have been doing a lot of community education. We've been meeting with the Department of Justice a lot, trying to hold them accountable in getting FBI to mandate reporting of anti-Asian hate incidences, because police departments across the country submit their reports to FBI, and FBI annually releases a report on hate crimes across the country at the end of the year. And continuously, the column for hate crimes against Asians have been reported as just zeros. But we know through our own community trackers like Stop AAPI Hate, AJC, OCA, SALDEF, we know that hate incidences have continued to be reported since 9/11. Which is when we started tracking until now. And we saw a 300+% increase in hate crimes, right? And so why is the FBI releasing these reports with zeros? So meeting with DOJ to hold them accountable to that, also to have them conduct, cultural competency trainings for their officers, not just in FBI branches, but in police departments, so that whenever they are responding to an anti-Asian hate incident, that they are being mindful about how they respond and not just blow off, an Asian American community member, because then that's why there's not a lot of trust in law enforcement. And then also making sure that the DOJ puts resources to support the victims of hate incidences and hate crimes, right? Which they were not putting aside before. And so, yeah, beyond meeting with DOJ, with Congress to pass, the anti-Asian hate legislation, Jabara Hire, Hate Act, things like that would set aside monetary resources. Just continue to meet with Congress members about like, hey, you can't use anti-Asian rhetoric in any kind of bill, legislation, etc. So beyond all of that, then we realized OCA is largely like young working professionals to retiree age, and we wanted to make sure that we bridge the intergenerational movement building. And that's when I saw kind of the growth in Dear Asian Youth and encouraged our chapters to work with their local Dear Asian Youth chapters in any kind of advocacy work that they're doing, especially now that things were opening up at the end of 2021, et cetera. So you see here a partnership between DAY and Dear OCA DC chapter. Next slide, there's a partnership between DAY Houston and our OCA Greater Houston chapter in doing testimonials to support Asian American ethnic studies. And so as we start to, as Dear Asian Youth also starts to try to do more in-person events, we thought it would make sense for OCA that has the institution legacy, infrastructure legacy, with Dear Asian Youth and kind of help them with their policy agenda, but also leverage and build that intergenerational gap some more. So yeah, that's like a quick overview of our past 2.5, 3 years, going on 4 now on OCA's response to anti-Asian hate. Thanks for listening. So Philip.
Thank you both for the awesome, wonderful presentations on both of your organizations and the work that y'all are doing. Yeah, I'm taking it all in, right? Because I think a part of this is also us trying to figure out ways to educate ourselves on these different issues that arise, right? So I mean, honestly, if for the folks in the Zoom, the participants, y'all could share some affirmations or gas as we move on to the sort of second portion of our workshop today, which is a bit of a more targeted conversation on these two amazing API women who are engaging in this sort of work through their respective organizations. I want to talk to you or ask you both about like the personal connections that you have to this type of work, anti-Asian hate work, right? Like what was it that motivated each of you to take leadership roles in your respective organizations? Earlier in one of the in the keynote presentations, there was a mention of like this moment where Fee, who is the director at AAJC Atlanta, she felt like she became Asian American, right? Was there a moment like that for you that kind of sparked this sort of work? I'll start with Stephanie.
Yes, okay, I can go first. I think the most defining moment for me that told me this was work that like had to be done, and this was extremely like meaningful to me, and I kind of like really found my passion is when I saw people in my own community be impacted and be negatively affected by anti-Asian racism. So for some context, I lived in Southern California, but I lived in like a very like white area in Orange County, and also a very conservative area in Orange County. So my school district has had a history of being incredible. My high school district had a history of being incredibly problematic and racist. And during 2020, when there were all these conversations about racial justice and about police brutality and about racism within the school and education system as well, my friends and I actually decided to just release a Google form, because we had experienced racism in our district, and we kind of wanted to see if this was something that resonated with more people of color at our school. So we released a Google form. It was literally like distributed through social media. It was open for a week, and it was just like an open invitation. If you've experienced racism, if you, as a teacher, as a student, as a parent, has like experienced racism because of this school district or in this school district, please fill out this Google form. And then we ended up having more than 850 responses from different students, teachers, parents across the years. There were people who were like 40 years old filling out the forms, talking about their experiences with racism. And then there would be a sixth grader who's in middle school right now filling out an experience, that a racist experience that she's had. And I think that just showed me how little progress there had been in my school district. And I think a lot of it really was less so kind of like, it was, I think like what really made me want to get into activism was when I saw people in my own community get hurt. And really, I think what fueled me, especially at the beginning, and it still fuels me now, but it's turned into something a little bit different now, but especially at the very beginning, it was really just so much anger for what was happening in my district, just to see like these elementary school students repeatedly be subjected to discriminatory like practices from our teachers. And I think that was the moment when I was like, I feel like I need to do something for this community. I feel like there is like a personal responsibility to do something. So I think that was a very defining moment for me.
And Thu?
Yeah, I mean, I started working at OCA before the pandemic and anti-Asian hate. So you could say like I was already here, but I joined OCA, and also kind of something that I've been thinking about more over the past few years is the idea that like being an Asian American is inherently political. Our identities already, because we are Asian American, there's already a politicalness to it, either because we are immigrants, refugees, or sons and daughters or children of, and that has been impacted by policies and legislation, or even just the fact that the Chinese Exclusions Act was only overturned like a few decades ago, right? Pretty recently. And so just the inherent politicalness of being an Asian American has always, and the fact that a lot of people dissociate themselves from that, like they either, I grew up in west of Houston, Texas, in a neighborhood where there weren't, again, Asian Americans, similar to Stephanie, and neighborhood was predominantly white. And so the Asian Americans that I did meet, they didn't really think of the importance of being civically engaged. They didn't really think about how like policies impact, certain policies impact us more than others, etc. Yeah, so I think, for the anti-Asian hate, I come from a small business family. My family owns a nail salon in Houston. It's been running for 17 going on 18 years. And like with the rise in anti-Asian hate, that was like, a physical danger, like a tangible danger to my family that I saw. And then with the Atlanta spa shootings, like that was just really shocking. Like in the moment, I was like, okay, I have to respond as the leader of OCA, but also right now, I really just want to withdraw and go home, like run home and fly home and see what I can do to protect my family, even though there isn't much, right? If someone wants to come to the salon and shoot it up. But yeah, that was a a lot of what was personal and had to contend with in the past few years.
Yeah, thank you both for that. I mean, I think Stephanie, how you speak to these feelings of deep anger and resentment for what we're seeing around us, right? And to how you mentioned, when things get a little bit too close to home or feel like home, right? There's a sense of almost like viscerality in what's going on outside of what seems like outside of our control, right? And I feel like both of you in your work kind of mentioned these moments where through the work itself, we're able to find that almost find that knowledge of ourselves in our communities and then use that as sort of a motivator for the work, right? I mean, I've asked y'all both about your sort of these Asian moments that where you feel like you became Asian American, but I know both of your works also span across different Asian American ethnicities right? As well as across racial boundaries. And oftentimes, like I think both of you highlighted, there's this sense of almost tension that is sort of ever present when organizing across communities, right? So could y'all speak to maybe how you sought to address those tensions working across ethnic boundaries, but also racial boundaries?
Actually, I also wanted to ask Stephanie too, is because you have international chapters and members, how you, it's for Stephanie even, it's not beyond ethnic racial boundaries, but also country boundaries, right? Because then you're balancing, the interest of their interests and then also everything going on in the US. But I don't know, I think there was an uptick in anti-Asian hate across the globe, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, especially the international aspect, it's been like incredibly just amazing getting to know so many people from all these different countries that I've not even been to some of the countries that our members are from, where some of my closest friends live, and from Dear Asian Youth. And I think what really, I think having worked with so many international members and just working with them on like different advocacy issues shows me and has like given me so much perspective about just how Western centric a lot of advocacy is, and how sometimes like we forget a lot of the problems that are existing in other countries. Like it's so jarring when, one of my closest friends from Dear Asian Youth, who is like works on our executive board, and she's telling me about, and she lives in Pakistan, and she's telling me about all the floods and the dangers that her family face. I think it just really gives me so much perspective as to like, yes, definitely the issues within the US are very, very important and need to be focused on. And there are a lot of like tensions that need to be addressed, but also there are all of these very real problems that people across the world experience. And sometimes like I catch myself forgetting about that and like almost being too zoned in on one issue and forgetting to address so many other things that real people are experiencing. And I think that has just given me like a much richer perspective on life. And in terms of like racial and ethnic boundaries too within the US, and like I think something that has been instrumental in my growth since I've founded Dear Asian Youth was also just the recognition of all the different ethnicities and countries and regions that exist within Asia. And on top of that, how a lot of the times Asian advocacy, specifically in the US, is driven and centered only like on East Asians, and how a lot of the times we erase the narratives of Southeast Asians, South Asians, West, Central, North Asians. And I think that's also a very real conversation that I'm starting to see, but really I don't think has been a big topic of discussion until recent years. And so I think that too has given me a lot of awareness and perspective in the way that I conduct my advocacy work.
Yeah, well, because I think right now we're even still trying to overcome the conversation around like integrating Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, right? Like using that acronym AAPI. It's like we jumped from like Asian American AA to AAPI, and then there's like the like fringe conversations about, all right, what about the South Asians, Southeast Asians, and then like Native Hawaiians, and now we say the White House has adopted ANHPI, but there's still questions. I get this question like every other week, I feel like, is like, oh, why don't you use APITA, which is Asian American Desi Pacific Islander Desi American, something like that, right? Like incorporating Desi, and it's like, oh, well, Desi doesn't necessarily incorporate all South Asians, right? That's a specific subset of like Indian Americans, etc. And so, yeah, similar to you, Stephanie, I think being a Southeast Asian, I'm Vietnamese American, leading a historically Chinese organization. Like we were founded in 1973 as an organization of Chinese Americans. In 2013, rebranded to be just OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates, because we saw that our chapters and members, depending on where they were, like in Utah, there's a lot of PI members of OCA. In Seattle, a lot of Vietnamese American members of OCA, et cetera. So we knew we were diversifying, reflective of the general API community in the US. So we rebranded, but like you said, Stephanie, a lot of the dominant narratives, policy initiatives within OCA were still, you know, even up until 5 years ago when I joined OCA, like East Asian centric. And so it wasn't until I joined that we started raising the questions of like, well, a lot of Southeast Asians are being deported, or in the narrative of like undocumented Americans. There's a lot of Asian American, undocumented Americans, like Chinese American as well, but like this is not just a Latino issue, etc. It's also a Black and Asian issue. And so I think, yeah, knowing that I'm different from what OCA has historically been, and then having been raised in a community where like I was the only Asian American in a low income Latino white neighborhood, I think I kind of grew into that perspective of like trying to make sure OCA's advocacy work comes from like doesn't leave anyone behind or doesn't close the doors on anyone, right? And that gets kind of difficult when at the federal level when you're negotiating legislation. And you know, I won't name names, but you know, a few years ago when talking about the border wall and what we would kind of give or take, what are we willing to compromise on in immigration legislation and border walls, that was a really tough conversation across racial communities. And then now recently, having certain conversations with law enforcement and the division within the API community, because some of us are light-skinned and some folks are dark-skinned and more prone to stop and frisk, racial profiling, etc. Right? Like the South Asian community has definitely experienced more police brutality or stop and frisking than like, you know, lighter-skinned Asian Americans. And so yeah, I forget the question. Oh, like how to navigate all that. I think we're still figuring it out. But for me, it's just as long as we're aware of those questions and those divisions, because some people operate without even thinking of it in the first place. So yeah.
Yes, thank you all for that. I think the way in which we acknowledge the multiplicity of what being Asian American means, how we understand that the Asian American identity is one that was fought for and formed and political, and that for the sake, not just the sake of inclusion, but for the sake of our lives and what we're fighting for, right? To be able to accurately name who it is that we're fighting for and who it is that we're fighting with, I think becomes particularly important as we do both work on the ground in our organizing, but also this in advocacy, right? I see you, Nick, with the question in the chat on, you know, as we center conversations on anti-AAPI hate, how is it that you navigate this anti-AAPI hate work and centering this conversation, especially when there are so many other forms of intersectionality and intersectional hate, right? Particularly Islamophobia, anti-LGBTQIA hate, without necessarily removing the needs or putting one community over another, one identity over another. Could you speak to or give some tips about how to do this intersectional work?
Do you want to start first, or?
Yeah, I'll pass it to you too.
I can start. Yeah. I think it's kind of helpful that anti-API hate conversations, it's never like a generic conversation, right? There's always some kind of context around it, whether it's like physical attacks or like online harassment and hate, or microaggressions, etc. And I think in those different avenues of hate, they're like, I think the most important thing is to bring people to the table with different intersectional identities, right? So for example, like I identify as an Asian American woman, and at a table of like talking about online harassment, right? We also want to make sure that there are people there who are people at the table. So like I represent Asian American women, for example, but then we want someone who is from the LGBT community, from the Muslim community, etc. Because I don't think there is it's not like mutually exclusive, right? In terms of whenever we talk about like anti-API hate, because I think to kind of give a more parallel example that's maybe easier to wrap even my head around it right now is like police brutality, right? Police brutality and the different communities that are impacted by police brutality, like there's multiple, right? And I think it's a matter of making sure we name them all. And even though there's it's difficult to say have a generic solution, right? Like for example, Congress passed like the COVID-19 hate crimes bill, or like the anti-Asian there's another anti-Asian hate crimes bill or something like that, that perhaps was really generic. But I think the important bit for like these more generic solutions, etc., is that people from all different communities, from all different identities, are being brought to the table to access whatever bit of the solution it is for their own communities, right? I'm going to pause there because I think I'm still formulating like what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, well said. I think also there's no easy way to respond to this question. I think it's definitely like a multifaceted approach, but I think the most important thing for me, I think to remember is exactly what Thu said. It's not mutually exclusive. Like you can be Muslim and Asian, you can be part of the LGBTQ community and Asian. And I think by having that awareness, and by like, how can I say this? By just like recognizing that a lot of our identities are inherently intersectional, I think that allows us to maybe less see it in a way of, oh, this is an LGBTQ issue or this is an Asian issue, and kind of more see it as like this issue that affects a lot of communities, a lot of like marginalized communities or a lot of people of minoritized identities. And I think if we approach solutions through an intersectional lens, I think like that's how I would kind of drive forward the conversation.
Yeah, actually, I just realized what it was. I think, and Nick, thank you, and Philip too, is what you were reminding me is that when you're having a conversation about hate or discrimination, bias, etc., to be specific. I think I said earlier, name everything that it is, because, so for example, I and OCA's comms, we've been pivoting to, like, we'll use API in a general sense, but whenever we're talking about issues and we issue press releases on certain issues, policies, incidences, we don't just use API. If it's just pertinent to the Asian American community, we will say just Asian American. We won't say API, right? Because y'all are absolutely right in the chat that like the Pacific Islanders have faced different kinds of hate. For example, a lot of the past few years during this pandemic, they may not have faced like the type of anti-Asian incidents have been reported in mainstream media. The anti-PI hate has been the fact that their community has been like over indexed on deaths by COVID-19, right? Because a lot of them are frontline workers who have not been supported. Their community hasn't been able to access COVID-19 resources, etc., right? And that in and of itself is like an institutional act of like anti-PI hate, right? And then even then, OCA works with a lot of different organizations. Like we work with the Anti-Defamation League, historically Jewish American organization, right? And so I get the question of like, how do you balance working with the ADL and also supporting the Muslim community, right? That faces Islamophobic hate, anti-Islamophobic hate, etc. And I think that's because for OCA, like, again, the different contexts in which we talk about hate manifests in different ways. And, thankfully the API is quite diverse, where we show up in each of these, we are able to show up in each of these conversations, each of these avenues, and still, like, at the end of the day, it's anti-hate work that we do, right? Not just anti-API hate that we do, work that we do. And the question about OCA changing its name, currently it's a tax paperwork issue, but that is an internal conversation we have been having in the past year. Yes.
I think my gears are turning right now. Like I'm trying to like capture all the, I think doing the solidarity work is difficult, and it is tense. Not only is solidarity work across ethnic racial groups, but across all intersections, right? To be able to say that your struggle is my struggle is something that is quite difficult to articulate, right? Especially when we see so much struggle being amplified through, all channels, everywhere, all the time, especially over the past couple of years, right? And I think, and I want to point out, I think for us in Silicon Valley, what we do well, what I've seen us do well, is build coalition across different groups that are to work together in coalition with different groups, right? So just wanted to put that out there. I think one of the things that we oftentimes have difficulty with in the coalition work that we do, right, is that I think for those of us who are able to speak English, are like technologically literate, are in these organizing spaces already. There's a part of it that sort of makes sense to us already, right? And we're able to find each other to articulate the same points that we're making even here in this workshop conversation, right? With our elders, right? Or with like our youth. Like, for example, I mean, in my Asian American studies classes, right? Like this is the stuff we're talking about, but I don't think they're going to be as like hyped up about it as like the folks at the API Civic Leadership Summit would be, right? At first sight. So I wanted to ask you both also on this question of how we organize multi-generationally, if y'all have any tips, and Stephanie, you know, with the Dear Asian Youth letters, how is it that you reach to other Asian youth across the United States, but also across the world? And then two, for a historic organization, right? How is it that you address those tensions in the messaging?
Yeah, I can go really fast with this. So, I think for me, the main reason why I continued my work with Asian youth and like started it in the first place is really because I didn't see any organizations that were specifically dedicated to Asian youth activism. Even like there weren't any, at least nationwide or worldwide, organizations specifically dedicated to that cause. And for me, I was like, I can't believe that this isn't a thing yet, because so many young people that I knew were so like angry and had so much fire in them and wanted to make change so bad, but they really just didn't have an outlet to do that. And I think for me, what's been difficult about being in advocacy spaces in the past, especially in places where maybe the people who are leading like the organization are all over 60. It's just like they don't really, a lot of the times it's like it's not an incredibly like welcoming environment for young people, and that there isn't a lot of trust in young people. And granted, like experience is that older generations have with activism is incredibly valuable, but I also think in the past, my experiences with other advocacy organizations was that I wasn't really taken seriously. And I think for Dear Asian Youth, how we were able to get other young people involved was that like that fire and passion was already there in them. Dear Asian Youth really just only served as an outlet for them to be able to do that. And I think because of the fact that it was led by a bunch of young people, and it was for young people, it made it so that we trusted our team members and we were able to kind of like give them a voice, give them something that they had been seeking out so badly for so long. I think another crucial part about mobilizing young people is also through social media, which I think is a pretty underutilized tool for some other like advocacy organizations that I think would be a really good place to tap into. Just because, especially for young people, like the way we mobilize is different. Like even our senses of humor is arguably a little different. So I think just like the way that we communicate, the way we mobilize, the way we organize is all inherently different. And I think because we were led by a bunch of young people and we were able to get that messaging across on social media, I think that's how we were able to grow so fast and reach so many different people in different corners of the world. And I think for like maybe other advocacy organizations who want to bring in more young people, who want to bring in young people to become more civically engaged, I think the answer really is to have young people kind of like lead the charge in getting other students involved. So that's kind of like how I think Dear Asian Youth got our way started. And I think OCA does a really incredible job with that. I know like the Las Vegas chapter has a youth program and everything. Actually, one of my really, really good friends at Harvard now was in the youth mentorship program at the Las Vegas chapter. His name is Ethan too. You might know him. Yeah, but I just saw him last night actually. So no, like when I've talked to him about it, he's always talked about how life-changing OCA has been for him. And I think OCA is like a great example of an organization that is actively bringing in young people by having young people lead the charge.
That's a long time coming though, actually, because OCA, I mean, even up until I became the executive director a year ago on Tuesday, actually. And up until then, even it's still very antiquated, like one of the old dinosaur organizations, honestly, right? But I also, kind of like your friend, I also came up through an OCA chapter because OCA Greater Houston. So like we have certain OCA chapters that are more, they take more risk. They're more forward thinking in how they approach advocacy and outreach. And so like one of the easiest things I think that I tell the OCA chapters and just any organization is like, you can have youth board members, right? Like a lot of the times a board of a nonprofit, of an organization, there's like give or get, right? That's a financial barrier. You know, you have to give or get $1,200, $5,000. There's usually some kind of, you know, a vetting committee that board members take a look at your resume and, you know, your career, etc. But you can have youth board members who are high school or college students, because we know, I mean, not just now that Dear Asian Youth has come up, but we just all know from either your own experiences talking to youth nowadays or just from what you've seen in the media, but like the youth have like good new ideas. Like Stephanie said, they have the passion and energy to do it. Like a lot of times, you know, our organizations are all volunteer based, or, you know, these boards, you know, we all have daytime jobs that the board, like your board position is a side thing. And so having youth board members, there's a lot of benefits to that, as well as building that pipeline and that inroad into the intergenerational building with the youth. And then on the flip side, I think it's been helpful for me is that I sit on the cusp of like millennial and Gen Z, and then I am very deeply I am very well connected to my parents and my family, and we talk about politics a lot, whether or not we align. And so like I think I also bring to OCA a kind of better understanding of like, what are all the different generations, what are they thinking, where are they coming from? And one of the important things to me too is that I love the gung-ho, the fire, the honestly sometimes radicalness that youth bring to the table, but sometimes they also forget where older generations have come from, like where they have been, what they've experienced. And on the flip side, the older generation forgets what our youth have seen growing up. Every year since I would say I was in like 3rd or 4th or 5th grade, like very young in elementary school. Every single year there has been a mass shooting inside of a school, right? That is what our generation has grown up with. And the older generations forget that this is what our kids are seeing and experiencing, you know, day to day. So they do know, they do have things that they have experienced and can talk about, right? And so I think there needs to be more of, you know, folks like Stephanie, you know, although you're like solidly Gen Z, but like Philip, you know, you're around my age, like folks like this kind of middle generation, and even here there's a alpha generation, right? That's like the new middle schoolers or something like that. Like the next generations, we're about to have like 4 or 5 generations working under the same roof in corporate America, nonprofit advocacy spaces. Like there really needs to be an emphasis on this like intergenerational understanding. And for me, that's just a lot of like transparency, storytelling, like Stephanie had mentioned that Dear Asian Youth does. And I think like storytelling is one of the easiest way we can get to understand where we each come from, right? So yeah.
Speaking of storytelling, so I dropped the collaboration that the your 2 organizations are doing in this sort of exemplification of how we can think about doing intergenerational work. Could y'all speak a little bit more to it? And are there any samples that you can provide us of the special edition image magazine that y'all are going to be distributing?
I couldn't pull up the draft in time, so perhaps you can just wait until the digital version drops, I think in December. Right now it was a 1-print run only, so unfortunately everyone has missed the pre-order deadline, and it's currently printing and mailing out, but it'll be released digitally like in November, December. That was because, so Image Magazine is OCA's publication for our members. We've been publishing it since like 1975 or something, quite long ago, annually. And for this year's edition, I, again, along that line, thinking of wanting to have that intergenerational understanding. OCA's members is, I think, 40% over the age of 50 or something like that. So still largely like older. And so I want them to see and hear and read, like, this is what our youth are thinking, what they make and do and are able to write. And so I reached out to Stephanie and Dear Asian Youth. I was like, hey, like, would you want to have some pieces here, or just have all the pieces here? And I think they were also trying to find an avenue for print publication as well, because to us, I mean, I don't know if you all have seen it, but there's a revival of print, right? Bookstores, etc. Kind of how there's a revival of vinyl, but yeah, so I think it just kind of worked out. Yeah, Stephanie, you want to talk about, magazines and printing?
Yeah, exactly what you said. Super lucky to have been able to like work with the OCA on this, because we have been really wanting to publish a physical magazine. Because again, like we started out as a blog, right? So writing really has always been core to what Dear Asian Youth does. And I just know so many Dear Asian Youth members who are like so excited to see their work and to see their work that it's going to be like in a physical printed magazine. And I think even beyond like the people who are going to be reading our magazine, I just felt like incredibly happy that and like felt so much gratitude towards OCA, of course, that so many of the members of our team who are like sometimes even like 14 or 15 and kind of just like writing about their identity are going to be able to see their work printed. And I think that's incredibly special.
Yeah, I think one of the values that I brought from like my college organizing days is that, like, yeah, it's great for us to be highlighting the API celebrities that are out there, like, Hollywood or social media influencers, etc. That's really great. But as coming from, a grassroots standpoint, it's like the stories that matter, the people who we should be uplifting are like the everyday people that we live and work with, right? Our own youth, our own elders, etc. And so like you shouldn't have to have like some kind of credential or whatever to be published anywhere, right? If you what you have to say matters, or everyone has something to say and it matters. And so like if there is a way that we can publish and give a platform to the everyday voices, like that's what we want to do, because that's what is much more relevant and tangible. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. And especially, seeing these Asian celebrities out there. I think representation is one point that we hone in on as an AAPI community often, right? Like I remember seeing Simu and Giannis Antetokounmpo while watching the Warriors game. But, I think going beyond representation, trying to figure out the real life repercussions of the work that we're doing, right? Working with our elders, trying to engage with the youth, and mobilize folks to do the work is so incredibly inspiring, and the work that you both do is so incredibly inspiring. I'm going to stop the recording in a second just to kind of open up the room, but as a segue out of this more formal part of the workshop itself, as this year's theme focuses on Asian American women, could y'all speak to some of your sheroes who have inspired you in your work?
I can start off. So a little bit of a generic answer, but it's so true for me, is definitely my mom. She is like by far the strongest woman that I know. And my mom like isn't really one who's like super political or into activism, so we're very different in that way. But I think she gave me a lot of values that I carry into like my work with activism. So I think one of the most important things that she taught me, and one of the most important qualities that I have as a person because of her, is her relentless optimism, and that like no matter how bad a day is, or no matter how bad you think something is, everything will always be okay. And I think I've really, really carried a lot of that into my work with activism, because like advocacy is can be so draining sometimes. Burnout is definitely so real, especially when you feel like you're constantly fighting and there is a lot of anger, and sometimes you're not seeing the changes that you want to see, at least at the pace that you want to see them change at. And I think just having that optimism, having that hopefulness has been so important in my journey of continuing with my activism. So I think my mom really, really taught me everything that I know about kind of just like my perspective and attitude on life. So she's definitely my hero.
I have a few. I think when I first got to DC, two sheroes who stood out to me, and I now model my like leadership and work after them, is Quyen Din from CRAC and Kat Ballet from SEAC Village out on the East Coast. And so those two, Quyen Din taught me the importance of maintaining yourself. And this is actually something that a lot of Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander women in DC who I've met continue to remind me and teach me, is that yeah, like we have to sustain ourselves in order to continue the work that we do in sustaining community. And so it's like sometimes a radical idea to like, you know, take every other Friday off, etc. But it's like breaking down these like white supremacist work culture that is embedded in our advocacy work for the AAPI community, right? And then I think too is Kat Lay from SEAC Village. She had said something at one of the very first galas events that I went to when I first started OCA. She had said, everything that we do knowing that it's for the future generations. And so like being grounded in that, it's okay if you don't see change or you don't feel that things are happening immediately, right? Because you just ground yourself in the hope and faith of the future generations. And I think, yeah, those two are my sheroes right now.
Thank y'all both for sharing that with us. I'm gonna talk to the folks who are gonna watch this recording later. Hope y'all enjoy this wonderful conversation with both Stephanie and Thu on different ways that we can address anti-Asian hate. And you can learn more about them by visiting at OCA National or at Dear Asian Youth on all handles, all channels. All right.